Hello and welcome to our 16-part documentary, which aims to shed light on the darkest chapter of German history and the harsh realities of the Second World War. In this first episode, I will talk about the beginning of the war. 84 years ago, on September 1st, 1939, when the city of Danzig was shelled by the German Navy and then Poland was invaded by the German army. The Second World War began on September 1st, 1939, when the Nazi German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the port of Danzig. The ship began a serial bombardment, firing 67 shells in 10 minutes. Then attacked the German infantry. The 3rd Stuka Squadron, which had taken off from East Prussia, bombarded the Westerplatte near Danzig relentlessly.
Polen hat heute Nacht zum ersten Mal auf unserem eigenen Territorium auch mit bereits regulären Soldaten geschossen.
We have been returning fire since 5:45 a.m. Hitler's propaganda machine tried to portray the beginning of the war as a Polish attack on German soldiers. In fact, everything was proceeding exactly according to the plan that had been drawn up months before. Simultaneously with the attack on Danzig, 54 German divisions began invading Poland. The governments in London and Paris immediately demanded the withdrawal of German troops and issued an ultimatum. But this ultimatum was left unanswered by Germany. In the early morning, the Germans invaded the state institutions in Danzig in a surprise raid. However, about 50 civil servants had taken up positions in the post office building. They had received arms and ammunition from Warsaw weeks earlier and were supposed to hold it until the Polish army arrived. But the men were fighting a battle they could never win. When the Germans set fire to the building, the survivors were forced to surrender. They were immediately court-martialed by the German army and executed by firing squad. On September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on the Third Reich. Air raid alerts were sounded in the streets of Paris. Fearing German air raids, people practiced fleeing to shelters and using gas masks. An American journalist noted that day, "What makes this war seem extraordinary is the local nonsense and the time diplomats spend talking. In fact, it is more like an ordinary war of independence. But because it has the potential for a massive war machine, it could unfortunately mean the collapse of Western culture." As an American businessman records the mobilization of British troops on the Channel Island of Guernsey, the British are preparing to come to the aid of their allies, the French, who are awaiting a German attack. The time for the British long-standing policy of appeasement had passed. The British declaration of war took Hitler by surprise. Although the British had pledged support for Poland, Hitler had assumed that it would not come to war. This gave him a sudden fright, but he still thought that if he could defeat the British and French in the West, Britain would come to its senses and perhaps help him in his real goal, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Since September 4, Hitler had always been close to the front. Franz Halder, the chief of the general staff, was confident that the enemy would be defeated as early as September 5. Even before the campaign began, Hitler had often stated that his goal was the complete destruction of Poland. Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Reich Security Office, said that the leading stratum of the population would be rendered harmless. Franz Halder's memos talked about the cleaning job. For example, Jews, intellectuals, artisans, and nobility. But many officers in the German army found it difficult to accept that SS Chief Heinrich Himmler and his henchmen had begun a bloody purge behind the front lines. About 60% of the murders of Polish civilians during the campaign were committed by Wehrmacht soldiers. When some generals protested and investigated the massacres of Jews and Poles, Hitler protected the mass murderers and said, "The war could not be waged by the methods of the Salvation Army." Hermann Göring's Air Force Luftwaffe was not fully operational, but it was far superior to the enemy in the Blitzkrieg against Poland, and within days it had gained air supremacy. Tens of thousands of civilians lost their lives in the defense of Warsaw. For Hitler, it was not about justice in war, but about victory. He demanded ruthlessness and harshness from the army. The Wehrmacht had to close its heart to mercy. Poland should have only one master, the Germans. On September 15, under the FHR's gaze, Wehrmacht troops crossed the San River on a makeshift bridge. Warsaw had been besieged for days. The Poles defending the city held out until September 28, when they were forced to surrender. Faced with the Wehrmacht's superiority of 1.5 million troops, the last Polish resistors surrendered on October 6, 1939. Only some of the Polish soldiers escaped to Hungary and Romania. Around 70,000 members of the Polish forces were killed in action and 133,000 wounded. The Germans suffered only 11,000 casualties in the fighting. Initially, Hitler's generals had no idea that Joseph Stalin would also share in the spoils. Under a secret additional protocol to the German-Soviet non-aggression pact, Red Army troops entered Poland on September 17 and occupied the east of the country. A demarcation line along the Bug River was agreed between Germany and the Soviets. On September 28, a German-Soviet treaty of friendship was signed. Accordingly, the Soviet Union annexed eastern Poland, while the western part of Poland was annexed to the Third Reich. And the rest became part of the German Viceroyalty. There, secret police and political officials launched a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign and deported thousands of Polish intellectuals. Many were murdered. For a time, Stalin worked in accordance with Hitler's wishes. German communists and Polish Jews were handed over to the Gestapo. Soviet supply depots were almost empty to fuel Hitler's tanks. But the euphoria of the victory did not spread among the population as quickly as desired. As is well known, the enthusiasm was not as great as the Nazis would have liked. Goebbels was disappointed that an atmosphere similar to that of August 1914 could not be created without further prolongation. And more effort was needed to convey the impression to the population and also to the world public opinion that Poland was quickly finished. The alliance with Stalin for strategic reasons meant that there was no need to worry and that the Wehrmacht and the economy were ready for war at any moment. And peace-like conditions continued to prevail in the Reich. In this respect, the Nazi leadership went to great lengths to avoid the impression that Germany would now find itself actually involved in a world war. In the streets of Warsaw, the German army, the Wehrmacht, honored Adolf Hitler with a victory parade. At this point, Hitler's power was now indisputable. Only a coup or an assassination against Hitler could save Germany from barbarism and ultimate collapse. This brings us to the end of the first part of our 16-part documentary about World War II. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and get notified so you don't miss any more episodes. Goodbye and see you in the second part of our documentary.